Have you ever wondered what makes a book a classic? Italo Calvino, in his book, Why Read the Classics, tells us that a classic is one that lends itself to innumerable interpretations because they never finish saying what they have to say, books that the more you think you know them by hearsay, the newer, unexpected and untold they seem to you when you read them. It sounds like poetry. Borges in his essay, On the Classics, affirms that a classic is a book that generations of men, urged on for various reasons, read with previous fervor and with a mysterious loyalty. But loyalty comes at a cost. Somerset Maugham tells us, in 10 Great Novels and Their Authors, in the chapter dedicated to Jane Austen. What makes a classic is not that critics praise it, teachers explain it, and study it in schools, but that a large number of readers, generation after generation, have found reading it pleasure and spiritual benefit. I have not yet found someone who truly enjoys The Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri, but many enjoy Boccaccio's Decameron. But it is true that sometimes the popular survives time and becomes the classic. After all the Odyssey and the Iliad apparently endured, thanks to the spoken word later collected by a certain Homer, which means that they were very popular stories and very liked by their public. And then there is the question of why they endure. And one more interesting, how many actually read them? And I want to ask it with emphasis, really, how many read, to cite an example, In Search of Lost Time, by Marcel Proust. In Search of Lost Time is perhaps the greatest novel written in the 20th century, by extension, at least, longer than Tolstoy's War and Peace, which is really saying a lot. Many, if not all, those who pretend to be literary connoisseurs claim to have read it. I have survived 2 of the books, it is the only thing I can say in my favor. But how many have read it in its entirety, or at least partially? It has 7 volumes, approximately 4,215 pages, which may vary depending on the edition, and totaling 1,267,069 words, in their original language, which is French, and which may also vary depending on which language it has been translated into. Add to this the difficulty of dealing with what is known as the stream of consciousness, through pages and pages, and word after word, the reader will face an incoherent thread of thoughts, images, ideas, or simply words that reflect the mood and spiritual state in the thoughts of its protagonist, together with repetitive passages, which emerge cyclically. Proust's prose is simply overwhelming, and surviving it is truly a mad adventure that some apparently like. I would like to know who. In my personal life I have met people who talk about books with the academic ease of a philologist. They are these pretentious and conceited who quote phrases, books, authors, and literary anecdotes like reciting a cooking recipe, spicing them up with curiosities and vignettes. Many times I ask them if they have read that Ulysses, by James Joyce, and when I get the desired response from the literary man, I quickly tell him a brief passage from the book, one well hidden among its pages, and of which no one has referred in any chronicle, literary criticism, or academic reference, adding, mischievously, some blackberries of my harvest. It doesn't take long for the fish to fall into the trap and bite the piece. Yes, the guy of the occasion has read the passage, that it does not exist. There are many classics, very many, that the connoisseurs, the trifle experts and literati have not actually read. Joyce, like Proust, and many times even poor Tolstoy himself are mentioned in hundreds of lists, in thousands of articles and blogs on the internet. I am not making it up if I say that 90% of those who speak of Joyce's Ulysses have never really read it, and are limited to knowing by synopses or third parties' references. Joyce's little book seems to be the key piece in the intellectual power of these characters. There are many that can be called classics. Why is Kafka's Metamorphosis a classic and Stephenie Meyer's Twilight is not? Kafka was not popular while he lived, and even today many people know him because he appears in the literary program of many educational systems in the Western world. But, really, how many have read it without having to? And most importantly, do they really understand the Czech stories? The Castle, the Judgment, the same Metamorphosis are very obscure stories, difficult to understand. Do young people of today read it? Unlike what you think, young people do read. Polls show it, the problem is not that they do not read, but the quality of what they read. However, ask the same person if they have read The Count of Monte Cristo, and the answer may invariably be yes, or at least he knows an abbreviated version of it. Sometimes the reality is that that person has only seen the last movie based on that book, unfortunately. Alexandre Dumas rarely makes the long list of classics, however, Marcel Proust always appears. Sometimes it is quite annoying to see there are readers who have the hypocritical claim they have not wasted time reading Dumas, or Agatha Christie, or Stephanie Meyer herself, and yet they speak of Proust's In Search of Lost Time. I have the suspicion that they read more to the former than the latter. There is nothing wrong with reading Dumas or Mrs. Christie, and there is nothing wrong with reading E.L. James with her 50 Shades of Grey either. Just because a book is a classic does not mean that it is popular today or, at least, not even entertaining to read. Sorry, Joyce, but Ulysses is not entertaining at all, and yet I encourage many to try to read it, because it is important to know what experts call classic. I do believe that not even Joyce himself felt much happiness writing it. And yet, that Ulysses is not the most intricate to read. Try Finnegan's Wake, and you'll see what I mean when I talk about Joyce's unhappiness. Finnegan's Wake was created by Joyce over a 17-year period, written in an idiosyncratic jargon that combines fables, words and idioms invented by Joyce himself. It is literally a hieroglyph, and has been listed as the most difficult book in the Western literary canon. Those who hope to believe that Ulysses is far from that gibberish are wrong, but Finnegan's is a home run with the bases full and without leaving the batter's box. At the other extreme are the books that constitute the classics that we are scared of in the study programs in our schools, when we are students. They impart them to us in such arid and unsympathetic way that we decide to forget them for the rest of our lives, but if we gave them a second chance we would find them interesting, entertaining, and we would even confirm them as truly classics. Cervantes's Don Quixote is one of them. Yes, they are 2 volumes, and they deal with the crazy adventures of a happy mad gentleman, and although in its original form it is written in archaic Castilian Spanish, it is a very nice, entertaining, and wonderful book, if we can find it in an edition in which its language has been transcribed into the modern language we speak today. Despite the doubts, these editions do exist. Read it, please. It is the same with Shakespeare. No one can say that Romeo and Juliet is a boring story, or the inextricable Hamlet itself, but we must give Shakespeare the opportunity to interest us. You have to give the classics a second chance, and even a third. Dostoevsky wrote his novels in the second half of the 19th century, and some are long like The Brothers Karamazov, and others short like The Gambler, but all of them are intense and interesting. There is nothing more modern written that can exceed the intensity of Crime and Punishment. From the first pages Raskolnikov's wishes, vicissitudes, and sufferings burn, the writing is so passionate and intense that we find it difficult to separate from the book. How many bestsellers today have the intensity and timelessness of Dostoevsky? Very few. Of course, it is too pretentious to say that all the classics have been read, or that it is essential to read them all. The lists can grow depending on the tastes, the knowledge, the literary education received, and even the country of origin from where these lists of classics are made. There is also the case of one-book classics. Let me explain. Gustave Flaubert appears on all the lists of classics to read. Anyone can venture online and find that Madame Bovary appears in all of them. Madame Bovary is one of those great novels that deserves the second chance of the classics I was talking about before. It inspired the name of a disease, Bovarism. Flaubert wrote it based on real events that occurred, and it has been a symbol of the awakening of feminine consciousness from the moment of its publication, and that despite the fact that Emma Bovary's struggle is totally individual and instinctive. Flaubert, however, also wrote Sentimental Education, a novel that enjoys a great reputation among many literary critics, but whose protagonist is such an insignificant, tedious, and bland fellow that it is practically impossible to care what he is doing. The result can already be imagined: no one is interested in reading the book. This dichotomy between what critics consider good and what readers read, or want to read, is a phenomenon that is not new, it has always existed. Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, a renowned classic in its day, and even long after, never managed to be in the hearts of a wide mass of readers. Thomas Mann has the fascinating ability to be an intellectual with a culture so immense that it is capable of boring us. Today there are critics who assume Mann's classicism with caution, not precisely because of the possible literary faults in his work, but because some issues exogenous to it. There have been occasions when critics and the public have coincided, as is the case with Virginia Woolf, one of the greatest figures of the modernist movement within the genre of the novel, and an important figure in the world feminist movement. Mrs. Woolf was popular, and highly applauded by the holy quarters of literature. It is not a very common case, but it has existed. There are also books that have received high esteem from the public and critics. Some have disappeared from the historical memory of literature, and others have risen to the category of classics. Mary Johnston's To Have and to Hold was the best-selling book in America in 1900. Doesn't sound like much to you, does it? Of course not. It is an old book, another one that time has decided to forget. Literature may seem like a fickle lady, but when it delivers its verdict it is final and brutal. Both Hamlet and Don Quixote were also great successes from the first day of their publication. But they have not been forgotten, and are still included in all the lists of the classics. But what does good mean when we talk about literature? Or, more specifically, be good? We are so used to pontificating about good and bad, from our tiny one-man pulpits, that we often forget the difference between something being good, or bad, and something appearing good or bad to us. Being is not exactly the same as appearing. Perhaps we should, in the name of our love of reading, develop a double criterion. That of knowing if that book is good or not, and that of whether it seems so to us. After all, we have every right not to like something good. Another thing is to be aware that this subjective opinion does not diminish its quality, no matter how subjective the literary quality is.